Chapter 1. It was a beautiful summer evening. Paul was happy. No more exams, no more college. His studies were finished, and now he needed a job. He wanted to be a writer and work for a newspaper. But first, he needed a break. The house was hot, and there was no wind. "I'll go for a walk," Paul said to himself. "I'll go down to the river." Paul lived in a small town, and soon, he was outside in the countryside. He walked near the river and watched the water birds. Suddenly, he saw a girl standing alone, gazing into the water. She was young and beautiful, with long dark hair, wearing a delicate white dress. Paul approached her. "Hello," he said. "What's your name?" "I'm Maria," she replied with a warm smile. They talked for a long time as the sun slowly set. It was nearly dark when Maria finally said, "I must go home." "Where do you live?" Paul asked. "In the big white house on the hill," Maria answered. Paul hesitated. "I live in the little brown house near the market." They laughed, but deep down, Paul felt a pang of sadness. Maria's house was grand and elegant. She was rich. He was poor. And yet, Paul was already in love. After that evening, Paul and Maria met often by the river. She always wore beautiful clothes and looked stunning. Paul thought about her all day, every day. One evening, he gathered the courage to speak his heart. "Listen, Maria, I've written a poem about you." He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and read. "I met her in the evening by the riverside. Her dress was creamy white, her hair with ribbon tied. She turned and smiled at me. I asked her for her name. Though I am young and poor, my love will stay the same." Maria's eyes shone. "You are wonderful, Paul. I love your poem." Paul took her hand and looked into her eyes. "I love you, Maria. Do you love me?" She smiled. "Yes, of course, I love you." Paul was overjoyed. He walked home that evening with his heart soaring. But his mother watched him carefully. "What's happened, Paul?" she asked. "Why are you so happy?" Paul only smiled. "It's nothing, Mother." His mother sighed. "He's in love," she thought. The next day, when Paul met Maria again by the river, she looked sad. But Paul, lost in his own happiness, did not notice. He took her hand. "Maria, I am poor now, but one day I will be a famous writer." Maria remained silent. "Will you marry me?" Paul asked. "Say yes. We will be so happy." He stopped. Maria's eyes filled with tears. Slowly, she shook her head, then turned and ran away. "Maria!" Paul called, but she had already disappeared. Paul walked home slowly, confused and heartbroken. "She loves me, doesn't she?" he thought. But his mother, seeing his face, already knew the truth. That night, a knock came at the door. Paul opened it to see a man in a servant's uniform. "I'm from the house on the hill," the man said. "My mistress wants to see you." Paul's heart pounded. Perhaps Maria has changed her mind. He followed the servant to the grand house. Inside, everything was luxurious: the carpets, the paintings, the chandeliers. Paul caught a glimpse of himself in a mirror. He looked terrible, poor and out of place. The servant led him into a room where an old woman sat in a large chair. Maria stood behind her, looking down. "So, you want to marry my daughter?" the old woman asked, her voice sharp and cold. Paul met her gaze. Yes. I love Maria, and I want to marry her. The old woman laughed. You? A poor student? No money, no father, nothing. My daughter will never marry you. Paul looked at Maria, hoping for her support, but she avoided his eyes. I am poor now, he said firmly, but one day, I will be a famous writer. The old woman laughed again. No. My daughter is not for you. She is getting married soon. You will never see her again. She stood and left the room, leaving Paul and Maria alone. He reached out to her, but she stepped back. I'm sorry, Paul, she whispered. My mother is right. I can't marry you. I don't want to be poor. I want money, clothes, and a grand life. Paul's heart shattered. But you love me, Maria. And I love you. She nodded sadly. Love isn't enough. Her voice trembled. I'm getting married in 2 weeks. Tears filled Paul's eyes. Goodbye, Maria, she said softly before turning away. Paul ran from the house and down to the river, collapsing by the water's edge. Maria loves me, he thought. I know she does. But she's marrying another man, for money. His mother was waiting for him at home. She saw his face and opened her arms. They are bad people, my son, she said. You must forget her. Paul didn't speak. But deep down, he knew he never would. Chapter 2. For many days, Paul did not see any of his friends. He barely spoke to his mother. His food remained untouched, and sleep refused to come. He often went to the river, sitting for hours in silence, watching the water flow, just like his life, slipping through his fingers. Everywhere he turned, he saw Maria's face. He remembered her smile, her laughter, the way she had looked at him with love. But now, she was gone. Gone to a life of wealth, luxury, and a man she did not love. One morning, as Paul sat in his small room staring at the ceiling, his mother walked in with a newspaper in her hand. Paul, she said softly. You should read this. He took the newspaper without interest, but as his eyes scanned the pages, his heart stopped. Rich man's beautiful bride. There, on the front page, was Maria's wedding photograph. She looked radiant in her white dress, diamonds sparkling around her neck. Beside her stood her husband, a man old enough to be her father, smiling with satisfaction. Paul's hands clenched the newspaper. He wanted to tear it apart, throw it into the fire, erase the image from his mind. He turned the page angrily, and then, something caught his eye. Write a story and win a prize. Paul sat up. It was a story competition organized by the same newspaper. The first prize was $500, along with a chance to be published. A spark lit inside him. This is my chance, he whispered. I'll write the story of Paul and Maria. The world will read it. And so will she. That very day, Paul began to write. He poured his pain, his anger, his love into his story. He wrote about their first meeting, the laughter by the river, the poetry, and finally, the betrayal. Each word was like a wound opening, but he did not stop. His mother watched him with quiet pride. He was eating again, talking again. There was life in his eyes. Weeks passed, and finally, the story was complete. He read it aloud to his mother, and tears shone in her eyes. It's beautiful, Paul, she said. You will win. With a deep breath, Paul sent his story to the newspaper and waited. Days turned into weeks. Then, one morning, a letter arrived. Paul's hands trembled as he gave it to his mother. You read it, Mother, he said. She opened the letter and gasped. Tears filled her eyes as she looked at him. Read it yourself, Paul. He took the letter and read. Dear Sir. I am very happy to inform you that you have won first prize in the story competition. Kindly visit our office on Thursday at 10 a.m. to receive your award." Paul jumped up, shouting with joy. "I did it, Mother! I won!" He danced around the kitchen, holding the letter. His mother laughed and clapped her hands. "I'll be a writer. We'll have money now. I'll buy you a new dress, new furniture." He suddenly stopped. A thought struck him. "Mother, do you think Maria will read my story?" His mother's smile faded. She looked at him for a long moment. "Do you still love her, Paul?" she asked softly. Paul hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. I always will." But deep inside, he felt something had changed. On Thursday, Paul went to the newspaper office. The manager shook his hand warmly. "Your story is brilliant," he said. "We need young writers like you. Would you like to work for our newspaper?" Paul's heart raced. His dream was coming true. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I would love to." And just like that, his new life began. But fate was not done with Paul and Maria yet. Chapter 3. Paul stepped into the newspaper office the next day, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. The scent of ink and paper filled the air, and the sound of typewriters clicking echoed around him. The editor, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a warm smile, greeted him. "Welcome, Paul. You have talent, real talent. We need fresh voices like yours." Paul felt pride swell in his chest. Just a few weeks ago, he had been drowning in despair. Now, he had a future. His first assignment was simple: write a weekly column. He could write about love, heartbreak, or anything he wished. Paul knew exactly what he would write about. His first column was titled "The Girl by the River." It told the story of two young lovers, separated by fate, longing for what could never be. He wrote with raw emotion, pouring his heart into every word. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured into the newspaper office. People praised his writing, some shared their own heartbreaks, and others simply wanted to know. Was the story real? But one letter caught Paul's attention. It was unsigned. "Your words haunt me. Are they meant for me?" Paul's heart pounded. He knew that handwriting. Maria. She had read his story. That night, Paul could not sleep. His mind raced with questions. Had she regretted leaving him? Was she unhappy? Did she still love him? Days passed, and Paul continued to write. Every week, a new chapter of The Girl by the River was published, and every week, another letter arrived. Why do you write about her if she is gone? Does she still live in your heart? What if she is trapped and waiting for you? Paul wanted to reply, but the letters had no return address. Then, one evening, as he walked home from the office, he saw a familiar figure standing by the river. His breath caught in his throat. Maria. She was dressed in a fine silk gown, but her eyes were filled with sorrow. She turned slowly as he approached. "Paul," she whispered. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything left unsaid. Then, she broke it. "Your stories," she said softly. "They are about us, aren't they?" Paul clenched his fists. "Why does it matter, Maria? You made your choice." Tears welled in her eyes. "You think it was a choice," she whispered. "I had no choice, Paul. My father forced me. He said if I refused, he would ruin your family." Paul's chest tightened. "Why didn't you tell me?" Maria looked away. "I wanted to. But by the time I could, it was too late. The wedding was arranged. I was trapped." Paul ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling inside him. "And now? Why are you here?" She stepped closer. "Because I read your words, Paul. And I had to see you. To know if you still," she hesitated, then whispered, "if you still love me." Paul swallowed hard. His heart screamed yes, but his mind was in chaos. She was married now. She belonged to another man. "I don't know, Maria," he finally said. "Maybe I'm just a fool who can't forget the past." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I must go," she murmured. "But if ever you find it in your heart to forgive me, I'll be waiting." Then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. Paul stood by the river for a long time, staring at the water, his heart torn between love and the cruel reality of fate. He had dreamed of this moment for so long. But now that it had come, he wasn't sure if he could bear it. And as the sun set, one thought haunted him. Was this the end of their story, or just the beginning? Chapter 4. Paul tried to move on, but Maria's words clung to his mind like ink staining a page. "If ever you find it in your heart to forgive me, I'll be waiting." But what was there to forgive? Her confession had shattered everything he believed, her betrayal, her marriage, even his own pain. It had never been her choice. He had spent years resenting her, only to learn she had suffered just as much. Yet, knowing the truth didn't change reality. Maria was still another man's wife. Paul buried himself in his work, pouring his emotions into his column. But his words became heavier, darker. Readers noticed. What happened to the romance? Is this a love story, or a tragedy? Then, another letter arrived. But this time, it wasn't from Maria. It was from her husband. "Stay away from my wife." The words were written in bold, angry strokes. No signature. No return address. Paul clenched his jaw. He had done nothing wrong. He hadn't sought Maria out, she had come to him. But the letter was a warning. And then, as if fate had more cruel games to play, Paul received an unexpected visitor at the newspaper office. A man in a tailored black suit. Tall, with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority. Don Alejandro de la Vega. Maria's husband. Paul recognized him from the wedding announcement in the papers years ago. A wealthy, influential landowner. Twice Maria's age. A man used to getting what he wanted. And right now, he wanted Paul to suffer. "I believe you've received my letter," Don Alejandro said, lowering himself into the chair across from Paul's desk. His voice was calm, but his presence filled the room with quiet menace. Paul met his gaze. "I have nothing to say to you." Don Alejandro smiled coldly. "Then listen." He leaned forward. "Maria is my wife. She belongs to me. Whatever past you shared with her is over." Paul felt rage simmer beneath his skin. "She is not a possession." The older man's smile faded. "She is mine by law. And I don't take kindly to men who think they can rewrite the past." Paul's fists clenched. He wanted to tell him the truth, that Maria still loved him, that she had never wanted the marriage. But he saw something in Don Alejandro's eyes. Danger. Power. A man who wouldn't hesitate to destroy anything, or anyone, who stood in his way. "You will leave this city," Don Alejandro continued. "Today. You will stop writing about her in your foolish stories, and you will forget she ever existed. If you don't..." He tilted his head. "I have ways of making men disappear." Paul's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a warning. It was a threat. And Paul knew Don Alejandro had the wealth and influence to make good on it. For the first time, fear crept into his heart. Not for himself, but for Maria. What if she was in danger? What if Don Alejandro had read more than just his stories? What if he knew about the letters? Paul forced himself to stay calm. "If Maria is truly yours, why are you so afraid of me?" Don Alejandro's expression darkened. He stood, adjusting the cuffs of his suit. "Be smart, young man. Leave. Before you regret staying." Then, without another word, he walked out. Paul sat there for a long time, his mind racing. He could leave, as Don Alejandro demanded. Or he could fight for Maria. But if he did, he wouldn't just be fighting for love. He would be fighting for survival. Chapter 5. Paul barely slept that night. Don Alejandro's threat echoed in his mind, each word laced with venom. The man had power, money, and influence, everything Paul didn't. If he wanted Paul gone, he had the means to make it happen. But Paul had never been the kind of man to run. And then there was Maria. Had Don Alejandro confronted her, too? Had she paid the price for daring to see him again? As dawn broke, Paul made a decision. He had to see her. That evening, Paul found himself standing outside a grand estate on the outskirts of the city. The iron gates loomed before him, guarded by two men in dark coats. He had no invitation, no right to be here, but he wasn't leaving without answers. A carriage rolled through the gate, its passenger hidden behind velvet curtains. For a brief moment, as the carriage passed under the gaslights, he caught a glimpse of delicate fingers clutching the window's edge. Maria. She was inside. Paul took a step forward, only for a firm hand to seize his shoulder. "You shouldn't be here." Paul turned sharply. A man stood before him, his face partially shadowed by his hat. He was younger than Don Alejandro, but carried the same air of quiet authority. "I have to see her," Paul said, his voice steady. The man studied him, then exhaled. "You don't understand. If Don Alejandro finds out..." "I don't care," Paul interrupted. "Is she safe?" The man hesitated, then nodded. "For now." That was not the reassurance Paul wanted. He narrowed his eyes. "Who are you?" The man glanced over his shoulder, then leaned in. "My name is Gabriel Morales. I work for Don Alejandro, but I also work against him." Paul's breath caught. "What do you mean?" Gabriel's jaw tightened. "Maria is in danger. You were right to be afraid for her. Don Alejandro knows more than he lets on. If you truly love her, you must leave before he uses you as a weapon against her." Paul's stomach twisted. "Then help me," he said. "If you really care about what happens to her, help me get her out." Gabriel hesitated. "That's impossible." Paul took a step closer. "Nothing is impossible." For the first time, Gabriel looked uncertain. "You don't understand the kind of man Don Alejandro is." Paul's voice was firm. "And you don't understand the kind of man I am." A tense silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Gabriel exhaled. "If we do this, there is no turning back." Paul met his gaze. "I never plan on turning back." Maria stood at the window of her room, staring out at the night. She had seen him. Paul. Just beyond the gates, standing where he had no right to be. And yet, she had wanted to run to him. But Don Alejandro's fury still lingered in the walls of this house. He knew. Not everything, but enough to be dangerous. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against the cold glass. She had made a mistake by seeing Paul again. But was it truly a mistake if it had been the only moment in years that had felt real? A soft knock at the door. Maria turned sharply. Then, a whisper. "Maria, it's me. Gabriel." She hurried to the door and unlocked it. He slipped inside, his face tense. "You don't have much time," he said quietly. "Paul is here." Maria's breath hitched. "Where?" "Outside the gate. He wants to get you out." Her heart pounded. "And you?" Gabriel hesitated. "Then, I'll help you." Maria grabbed his hands. "Then we have to act fast." Gabriel nodded. "Tonight." Paul waited in the shadows, his pulse quickening. The plan was simple: get Maria out before Don Alejandro realized what was happening. But simple plans had a way of turning into disasters. A faint noise behind him. Paul turned just as Gabriel emerged from the darkness. "She's coming." Paul exhaled in relief. "Let's move quickly." But before they could take another step, a gunshot shattered the night. Paul's heart slammed into his ribs. Then, the sound of heavy boots. And a cold voice. "You should have left when I gave you the chance." Don Alejandro stood at the top of the steps, his pistol still smoking. Maria was beside him, her wrist clutched tightly in his grasp. Terror filled her eyes. Paul's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a fight for love anymore. It was a fight for their lives.